of now will be recorded. So just giving you guys the heads up. All right. So let's move on. The first thing that I would like to do is just to give a recap of the workshop, the part one that we discussed, because I think that there's going to be a lot of relevant themes that we covered in the first workshop and how it entails to the critical information literacy and critical pedagogy that we'll be discussing today. So what I did was I first broke down anti-racism and what that means and how we will contribute to that concept, the action of anti-racism, which involves active and ongoing work toward racial equity and which is needed in institutions and organizations of all sizes, both public and private, to undo racist policies and practices. So for us, it will be in education and specifically higher education. And I think the key part of anti-racist work is to address institutional archaic practices that have old habits that affect the current demographic, right? Our students and what that looks like, and including libraries as well, the framework of libraries and how that institution in itself has archaic methods and practices that we should reform and we should continue to evolve from. We also moved on. We started to discuss fake news, but specifically misinformation, disinformation, and how there's a rise of both elements online specifically, especially as we look at how our library patrons consume and use all of that misinformation and disinformation. As a matter of fact, 55% of all US adults now get their news from social media, either often or sometimes, which is an 8% increase from 2017, which means that a lot of the information that they're just exposed to, that they're looking up, it's false essentially. And they're taking a lot of this information as gospel, which is something that we're trying to steer them away from, which also will tie into critical pedagogy, but more specifically, critical information literacy and why implementing that into the classroom is very important. Um, and speaking of that, we also discussed in the part one workshop, search engine and database bias and how that has an effect on patrons, whatever they're looking up when they're using either Google or our own academic databases, and how those systems have biases that can affect patron usage, especially as they're accessing information and what that looks like. And that ties into information privilege. So when we look at organizations or different institutions, we have to consider how they are distributing information and who has that privilege. So you have marginalized voices that need to be heard but don't have that access because of the privilege, and whether they can distribute that information or not to their consumers and their patrons. So we discussed all of that in the first workshop, and we are now going to move on to critical pedagogy. So when we look at this art of teaching, critical pedagogy essentially is the educational approach to help students achieve critical consciousness. In other words, encouraging students to question power structures that are oppressive and critically evaluate societal ideologies and institutional inequalities. And I just want to highlight this Venn diagram, which I find to be very important, because with critical pedagogy, it involves social justice as well as power and privilege. And with this agency part, it looks at the aspect of learning through discussion and engagement. So as we're looking at the agency part, we really focus on, in terms of critical pedagogy, allowing students to avoid the one-way approach of education where they're just looking at a text and they're taking it for what it is. Instead, critical pedagogy allows students to question what they're reading rather than just accepting either what the author is supposed to say or what um, the professor or educator is supposed to say, or what they're teaching them, right? They're challenging what they're reading, they're challenging the text, and they're actually reconstructing it so they can, discover their own, or they discover their own perspective in regards to the text that they're reading. So when it comes to critical consciousness, they're discovering oppression through education, encouraging the political action, right? So if you are assessing information online, or you're assessing information that is given to by the professor or whoever the educator is, it's actually you're analyzing that information, and in a way in which you're challenging that institution or that the information that you're reading. So again, the political act is very, very important. Okay, so when you are challenging students to examine the power structures and status quo of their surroundings, you are ensuring that the students are really digging deep into the information that they're reading. Okay, and that's extremely important. Now, what I would like to do is I would like to move to this part of the slide, which is a video of a director of school services. Her name is Nicole West Burns, and she is the director of school services for the Center for Urban Schooling at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. And since 2008, she has worked with educators in Ontario to support and guide professional learning, promoting equitable educational outcomes in schools for students using culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy skills. Now, I believe that Nicole West Burns will explain this in a much better way, because she, in this video, breaks down critical consciousness and how we can actually transform our learning environment in schools, especially as we look at the curriculum for education moving forward, and how that can positively affect students and how they can learn much more efficiently, and how they can be challenged in the classroom. But more importantly, as we look at our student demographic, it is constantly changing, it is constantly becoming more diverse. Therefore, we need to do the same. And when we look at implicit bias, many of us, especially as educators, tend to have that in our instruction. So in this video, she breaks that down in a much more intimate way, and she talks about the ways in which we can actually transform those learning environments. So we can build not only critical consciousness for our students, but we can build critical consciousness for ourselves, and how this involves critical pedagogy in the classroom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just copy and paste this YouTube link, and I'm going to put it in the chat so we can all watch it independently. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set a timer for roughly 7 minutes, because I want everyone to watch the video until 6 minutes and 5 seconds, only because it extends to 17 minutes. I don't want to have you guys watch the entire video. When you guys have watched that segment of the video, we're going to return to the workshop so we can discuss what she covered, and to talk about how we can create educational equity in our libraries, but specifically in our schools. So I want everyone to do that, and I'll see you guys in 7 minutes. All right, you guys. So we're going to return to the workshop so we can discuss what Nicole West Burns was referencing in her video, which I felt was very compelling, because I think that she touched on many elements. More importantly, I think that when she talked about critical consciousness and how not only do we need to evolve when it comes to our curricula for all educators in the classroom, I also think that her sense of inclusivity, right? Having an inclusive learning environment so all students feel comfortable when they walk into the classroom, and they have no question that they will feel either marginalized or left out in the lesson, I think is extremely key. And this is, not only for educators, but us as librarians as well, as we consider how we would like to set up our lesson plans moving forward. But I just wanted to ask the room if anyone had any personal thoughts on the video.
I liked it a lot. I'm actually literally adding it into a LibGuide as we speak. I was like, oh, this would go really well in this LibGuide that I have, and I'm literally adding it in as we go.
You know, her presentation was very informative, and I recommend everyone to watch the full video, because she goes into different solutions and how um, building that critical consciousness aspect can be applied into schools, into a curricula, into any type of classroom learning environment.
I liked at the beginning how she talks about, equity is about giving people what they need. And then she talks about how it's not the fact that they're lacking, it's the fact that the society that we live in is inherently inequitable. So it's not that person's fault that they need a little extra resource. It's the fact that our society is just inherently inequitable. So I thought that was very powerful. I'm actually giving a presentation tomorrow about being equity minded. I was like, yes, I'm going to include that. That's perfect.
No, definitely, definitely. Yeah, no, she touched on many things. And I think that in a way, she also highlighted an aspect of critical pedagogy. It's keeping in mind that these systems have taught us a certain way of processing information or learning or conforming, which is very important, especially as we assess information and we look deep into the text, not just for what it says, but behind where the information is coming from, which we'll talk about that more as we discuss the aspects of critical information literacy. But in regards to the critical pedagogy, I wanted to ask everyone, or if anyone had, um, any thoughts on this. What methods do you use to encourage student engagement in critical thinking in your classroom during your information literacy sessions, where you might touch on um, different topics that the students might be working on and then applying it to your lesson plan?
So I haven't done this, but I just want to share it because I was in a thing yesterday where a person did it and it was amazing. And I'm totally going to steal it and use it in the future. But there's something called visual thinking strategies. And you ask like 3 questions, like what do you see, what do you think about what you see, and what questions do you still have. And it's more for like images and things, but I think you could easily kind of translate it to like written material text and say like what do you see, like what are you reading and things. But it made you, like, we did an exercise with it and it really made us kind of think about the piece in a very different way and analyze it in a different way. And I think it really promoted that kind of like critical thinking aspect, because it was kind of, they were focused questions but they were open questions, and so I really liked that.
Yeah, no, the open questions is key because you're involving student discussion, and how those discussions involve different opinions, different perspectives, and that those shared ideas are involved when it comes to that critical pedagogy aspect. And when it comes to also our lesson planning, right? Something that Nicole West Burns mentioned was implicit bias, right? And how it can have an effect when it comes to our teaching and when we involve in our classroom, how our lesson plan is kind of set when we're teaching students. So I wanted to ask, has anyone experienced a moment during an information literacy session or just in a classroom setting in general where personal biases affected the lesson, whether it was you personally or an educator that you were observing?
So I'll share a time. I had just recently become the librarian to our English as a second language department. And I was teaching Boolean operators, and I asked the students to stand up if they had a brother, to stand up if they had a sister, to stand up if they had a brother and a sister. And nobody stood up when I said the and part. And the professor, she was really gracious. And she was like, the one child policy in China, like, a lot of them don't have siblings. And I was like mortified. I was absolutely mortified. And I quickly changed topics to like based on what they were wearing, because I thought that would be a little less like if you had sneakers on versus sandals or something. But it was so embarrassing and I've never done it again. And so if you could learn from my experience, please do that. And it was just a moment of ignorance and just not putting, two and two together. And so I tend to work very closely now with my my ESL students and the professors, and I share the slides with them beforehand, and I give them a rundown of my lesson plan, and I say like, am I on the right track? Like I'm not gonna mess up or anything. And they're really wonderful. They were that particular professor. She's been great. So to me afterwards, and I've been back several times, so I didn't totally mess up the relationship there, but yeah, that was a moment.
And Megan, I really appreciate you sharing that moment, because I think that it's more of a learning lesson than anything. And I think that when, Nicole West Burns mentions that we all have it, that's very true. And, including myself, everyone else. And when that moment happens in the classroom, we kind of process it, and then we learn from it, and we move forward by trying our best to just keeping in mind like the student demographic that we're working with, that we're teaching. And especially with the older professors that I would say like that just come from a different generation, we would experience that more, where a lot of lesson plans are like really set in stone, set in a very particular way, where keeping in mind with who's in the classroom might be in the back of their minds as well. So we tend to see that, especially as you go through, like for me personally, like the academic journals that I would read, especially entailing pedagogy, and how, with professors that have just a different way of teaching, some might just stick to their personal ways without trying to accommodate or to keep in mind a group of students that might be in their classroom. So that's what I've noticed as well.
I've had this, Megan, your example kind of reminded me of one where when I worked at the community college out in Western New York, we have a very large international student population, and there's a very large cohort that comes from Japan. And just our definitions and kind of like normal usage of English words. We had, I just remember this one instance in particular where a student was looking for a book on our book truck, and but he kept calling the book truck the basket, and I was so confused, and it took forever for me to figure out like what he was trying to actually like mean. And then he actually just like spotted it and was like, there we go. And I was like, what? And then I'm like, oh my gosh, like it still makes perfect sense, right? Like a basket is a container for something. And so just that kind of like language barrier that sometimes exists, or even like colloquialisms and slang and stuff. And yeah, that one like just popped in my head as you were talking, because I was just like, yes, I remember my days at the community college where I had a lot of those experiences. But now I'm like totally blanking on other ones, because that one's like stuck in my head at the moment. But there was another similar instance where when I'm just this past year teaching virtually, where I used an example in class for like talking about like internet and censorship and stuff. And it was, maybe not the right class/time to do that, because then there was a couple students who kind of jumped in, and the way they like phrased their answers, I wasn't really sure like which way they leaned on like censorship and particular like political parties and things. And I was just like, I don't know where this topic conversation is going to go. And I don't know if I'm super prepared to handle that at this moment, because this was more of just an example. And I just happened to pick those two keywords. And so like the professor is also kind of like chiming in, and he's very like opinionated. And I was just like, I don't know where this is going, and we need to get like back into the library lesson. Also mostly because those are all recorded, and I was like, I don't know where this is going to go, and I don't know if we want this recorded. And so I was just like, oh no. But you know, that was an instance where like I knew what my like personal biases are on this like topic matter, and I was like, I don't want to get into it right now with like a particular student. But yeah, that was an interesting moment for me this past like semester.
I had one that's it's not recent and it's not sort of from information literacy, but it was maybe the first time that I was confronted, not just with like personal biases, but maybe with a degree of privilege, was actually was when I was studying abroad, and we had to do like 3-hour language classes every day. So I'm like in with my language class, and the discussion of the day was talking about students and education and school. And I think, you know, the verb tense of the phrase that we were working with was like, I think blank should happen, or I think blank shouldn't happen. And so then we got into this whole, and I can't really remember how it happened, but someone I think said, I don't think students should have to pay for books. And I was like, but they don't. And it turned into like this whole, you know, we're all like, we all were speaking French as a second or whatever language, having this discussion about like textbooks. And finally, a student in the class, I think it was a student from like somewhere in South America, stopped. And she, because I was like the person raising the stink here, and she said, Holly, in the United States, do you pay for textbooks at school? And I was like, no, like students get those in public school. And everyone else was like, yeah, our students have to buy their books. And I was like, whoa. And that was really interesting, because I guess it's like, you know, we can come up with a lot of real, like, you know, just because the textbooks are free doesn't mean that they're not 30 years old. And like there's not great parts of it, but that was so interesting to be in this setting where everyone else in the room knew this thing that I completely was unaware of. And then when I realized that, you know, that there was this special circumstance that no one else experienced, I was like, wow, I really have to just think about that. And that really stopped me in my tracks, and it made an impression.
No, definitely. No, I appreciate you both, you know, Holly and Sarah, for sharing those experiences, because it happens all the time. Like, you know, the implicit bias, the information privilege, like just things that we don't necessarily think about all the time, but when it pops up, it gives you a perspective. And then at that moment in time, you'll kind of assess it, evaluate that situation, and then moving forward, you know, just keep in mind the privileges that we have, and how, you know, students may be affected by that or not. And I think that's the key to whether it's critical pedagogy or critical information literacy, to keep that in mind, especially as we introduce these, you know, these elements in the classroom. And that is actually going to lead to the next slide, which we'll be talking more about the genesis of critical pedagogy, where it came from. And this man, he's a bad man. His name is Paulo Freire, and he is a Brazilian educator. Back in the 1950s and 60s, he created a literacy program for the Brazilian peasants and many of the laborers that were just undergoing or experiencing harsh economic conditions. At that time, Brazilian was under a very authoritarian rule, a very authoritarian government, and there was a very noticeable hierarchy slash social class system. And with Freire, his influence, or what influenced him to become an educator and to really develop this critical pedagogy framework to actually teach people, you know, the different experiences that they were going through, was through Karl Marx. And Karl Marx also believed in class consciousness, which is the awareness of one's place in a system and how that system influences someone's living conditions. So with Friede, his objective was to highlight to students the importance of having um, or of having learners actively engage in their learning process and developing their own opinions and positions, which challenges essentially the hierarchy of power. And even in the classroom as well, because he also believed that there is a hierarchy system involving the educator slash teacher to the student. But more importantly, along with his teachings of social consciousness, more importantly, he viewed literacy as a political act and a form of action. So it's not just teaching students, the basic, core principles of, let's just say, history. It's assessing how your living conditions or how you're placed in society in real time, how that affects you and what you can do to actually solve those issues. And according to Friede, well, not according to Friede, in a academic journal where Fernando Nadic talks about his methodology, Friede believes that schools should empower learners toward participation and action by teaching them how to listen, how to identify alternatives, and how to consider possibilities, and how to search for multiple possible answers. And from this perspective, reading is a libertarian activity and not an action of conformity. So it really is the method of action, right? When you discover that there is an issue in regards to your living conditions, it's a matter of creating an action plan to resolve that issue, which just really digs deep into the class consciousness theory in terms of who has access to information and why there are certain marginalized groups that aren't as privileged as others. And with this literacy program, Freire was very, very successful at educating the impoverished indigenous people in Brazil at that time in terms of, understanding why they were in the conditions they were in. And his method of teaching, according to Don Belkin Martinez, who broke it down in 5 essentially like steps of teaching, was the to see, to analyze, and to act method. Now, with these steps, Don Belkin Martinez broke it down where it's easy to consume. Freire's methodology is a lot more complex, but essentially with his teachings, he would identify the problem, or he would have students identify the problem in the classroom. So making sure that they are researching the problem in terms of the issue and how they are experiencing that issue. And then he asks his students to produce codes, as he will call it, which is a representation of that particular problem. So whether he has students draw an image of what that problem looks like, or they verbally express it, or they create a video, it's the student engagement that is really important. And what he also does is he wants to see the situation as experienced by participants. So participants are asked to define the problems in the situation and make the link between themselves and the problem, which allows everyone to kind of, be, at the same place at the same time, experiencing conditions that they wouldn't usually experience. Or with the students that are, let's just say, impoverished or disadvantaged economically in any way, they can just express those conditions themselves. And following that is analyzing that problem or the situation. And in other words, it's asking themselves, why is this happening? And what are the immediate and root causes of the problem? And I think that is the key issue, especially as, students critically assess the information or the conditions of an oppressive institution. It's looking at the root of the problem, why it exists, and the demographic, right? The individuals that are affected by that problem. And finally, which separates critical pedagogy from any other educational methodology, is the act to change the situation. Again, Freire believes that having politics be intertwined with pedagogy is the only way any educator can teach any type of course content, because it involves the student and or participant to discuss an immediate plan to resolve the problems that exist, which is something that involves a lot of work. This is something that is like more of a long-term goal, but it has them critically think about the resolution so the issue doesn't exist anymore. And when they're doing that, they're actually producing a planning the action chart, which is essentially um, designing a framework where they're attacking the issue by adding all these elements together with the information that they have learned through the process. And during that time, as he was running this literacy program for a lot of the Brazilian peasants during the 50s and 60s, it was very effective, and they actually started to act on many of the economic hardships that they were experiencing, and they they made a lot of noise, to say the least, and they were effectively able to better their situations in many ways. And that's why Freire was very controversial in Brazil at the time, because he was opposing, the authoritarian rule, especially the government that were um, having a lot of the peasants experience these harsh conditions. But what's also key was that Freire believed that the teacher and the student can learn simultaneously. So he didn't necessarily believe in a hierarchical system when it came to the educator or whoever's teaching and the participants or students that were learning. He believes firmly that students and educators are equal participants in the learning process. So both parties are learning at the same time. And we might have seen this in the classroom. We might have experienced this where teachers would kind of use their position as the educator to use that position as a sense of power. So they're abusing it, and they'll just have that one-way approach where whatever they're teaching and or whatever text that they have these students assigned to read, it'll just be one opinion, and there's only one way to really perceive the information that exists or whatever information that they're assessing. Instead, with this model, you have students that can critique the classroom environment, that can critique the teacher's practices, and it can critique the information that's being given to them. And again, this goes with the flow of information and how that's being processed, and how the teacher is also learning from the student and vice versa. Now, I highly suggest reading Pedagogy of the Oppressed. This is Paulo Freire's book, where he expounds on a lot of his theories, especially as he digs deep into the framework of critical pedagogy and why that's important for all educators to integrate in their classroom, and how it can promote critical thinking and to evolve the way we process information, and how we could look at things much more critically. So we just discussed critical pedagogy. We talked about Paulo Freire. Now we're going to shift gears and discuss critical pedagogy. Critical information and how that connects to critical pedagogy, which in many ways it does. I have two quotes on this slide. The first one is from Eamon C. Toole, who is, to me, like, right now, he's at the vanguard of critical information literacy. And his material online, his articles are amazing. I highly recommend everyone to read his stuff, especially the articles that are available online. But from his research, right, as he started to interview librarians that were integrating critical information literacy into the classroom, the way he defines critical information literacy is the way of thinking and teaching that examines the social construction and political dimensions of libraries and information, problematizing information's production and use so that library users may think critically about such forces. And essentially what this means is using or going beyond information literacy and having students and patrons alike to address a lot of the oppressive institutions that create information, right? So when we look at news outlets, when we look at systems that produce information, even when we look at frameworks like the library, it's addressing a lot of the oppressive practices and traditions that have held true for so long. And the key thing is that with critical information literacy, you have librarians that are encouraging library users to be involved within the politics of information and how information exists and why it exists. And the common theme between critical information literacy and critical pedagogy is the consciousness. It's raising the social and critical awareness for both the librarian and the student. And as we have just discussed with the pedagogy part, with teaching all of this, it results in social justice. It results in some type of action to address this issue. And I also quoted Laura Sanders, who is a librarian from Simmons College, who talks about information literacy and social justice. And what she said was, advocating for critical and reflective pedagogy and praxis, or the application of theory into practice, encourages students to actively engage with information and information literacy competencies in order to develop a critical consciousness and to see themselves as people with agency and the ability to affect their own conditions. So actually taking the initiative to address these issues in real time and to critically think about the information that they have access to. Now, the issue, of course, is making sure that all of this being taught or teaching a lot of these elements is practically being integrated into the classroom, which is very important because we only have a one-shot instruction and there are many challenges. So when Eamon Toole, began to, do a lot of his research by asking librarians, how do they integrate critical information literacy into the classroom? The 5 primary themes that he took away was the art of classification or teaching classification to students, which is addressing or problematizing white heteropatriarchal foundations of knowledge. So whether that's looking at the databases or search engines or any type of institution that is predominantly run and or controlled by white men or just white people in general, it's looking at the hierarchy of knowledge and why that information is being published. And that's important because when we look at where information is coming from, addressing that issue is key because you know the reason why that information is being published in the first place. Another primary theme is just using search examples and how those examples can be tied into a student or a participant's personal life. So discussing subjects related to social justice is extremely key. Use an example like Freddie Gray or Black Lives Matter as we're teaching students search terms as they're looking up information in the databases and tying that in to their personal lives and then asking their perspectives on it or expounding on a lot of these key issues is extremely important because you're tying in information and contemporary themes that they can relate to. All right. Now, following that is discussing academic conventions and access. So this is information access and or information privilege, privileged sources. How you have, certain search engines that might be different from many others, like databases and information that students search for online and how many of those institutions are different. and why it's different and why certain people have access to this, particular information, and why others tend to not be, let's just say, noticed, or students don't necessarily have access to a certain group of information. That's very, very important. Corporate media, again, this is just piggybacking what we talked about with the access, biases in search algorithms. This was mentioned in the first workshop, and how Google, let's just say, will have suggested keywords that may pop up and will have a bias in terms of what the user is looking for. So the example that was used in the first workshop was victims of police brutality, and how the suggested keywords were were more derogatory towards the victims, who were predominantly people of color, rather than the police officer or whoever fatally shot and or killed the victim, and how they were, viewed as more of a not a martyr, but a hero with those suggested keywords and how they will pop up in that search engine, right? So there are biases when it comes to, even as we look at Google. And then finally, librarians will also mention alternative media. So this is specifically introducing questions of who gets to publish, as well as means of bringing in marginalized perspectives while showing students that their own voices could be heard. So we're looking at institutions that aren't as, let's just say, popular, right? Certain marginalized groups that don't have the privilege of producing or publishing information that is easily accessible, and what that looks like. Even though, for me personally, as I was looking up this information, the search examples, the classification, and the academic conventions and access was readily taught in the classroom, and they were used in a way where students can consume that information a little bit better, because for the search terms, it was very relatable to have students connect with a lot of the topics that were being introduced by librarians. The same goes for the patriarchal foundations, where you'll have institutions that are producing information that is very biased and very, set for a particular perspective, right? For just one perspective, rather than having a wide range of different voices, or, different sources of information. Now, of course, with critical information literacy in general, you have a ton of challenges, but the most noticeable challenges was the time, and how much the lack of time that we have in our one-shot model, or in our one-shot instruction. So when we're looking at how we can actually tie a lot of these themes into the classroom, we have to make sure that we can actually teach the students the standard, right? The basics of databases. Let's say you need to highlight, links on the library homepage. A lot of the information that is taught by critical information literacy librarians um, is very thoughtful. It requires a lot of dialogue. It also requires a lot of participation, where it takes up a lot of time. And another thing that I wanted to mention was that critical information literacy librarians tend to avoid searching, they tend to avoid having students search through the databases. Instead, they discuss more about the access of information. They talk about the information privilege. They talk about the different search terms, but not necessarily applying it to the databases. And this ties into student expectations, right? What are they expecting with an information literacy session? Most of them are just expecting the librarian to teach them how to use the databases. And I think that when it involves discussions that are this deep, they expect that to happen in their regular class, like with their professor teaching them these types of themes. So this really ties in also to faculty expectations and what that looks like. So when we're actually collaborating with our respective professor, and when we're talking about our itinerary for the class, we want to make sure that we're on the same page in terms of what we're going to be discussing. So if a faculty member wants a librarian to specifically discuss or to talk about databases, keywords very briefly, and MLA citation, it's a matter of how you can also introduce these important themes in your classroom, as well as the day-to-day database search and keywords. Now, as we mentioned, teaching the basics, which is, the database research, the keywords, that's important to teach too. But if you're trying to introduce critical information literacy, it just takes up way too much time. So it's just dealing with what is more important at that moment. And you also have institutional roadblocks. And what that essentially means is in the department with your supervisor, would they want you to go this deep into, discussions on institutional racism, oppression, and how information is accessed, whether in the databases or on Google and different search engines? That can be a challenge, because if your supervisor or the dean of your library discourages you from doing that, then you have a limitation. You can't really navigate the way in which you want to. So all of this was expressed in this research, especially as he interviewed librarians that would incorporate this in their classroom. They did their best to try and fit their lesson plan that involved critical information literacy type of themes, but these challenges were very significant as they tried to teach students the oppressive institutions that are, relevant today, especially as we look at information and how it's accessed. So when it comes to more information, especially when it relative to critical information literacy, this book is very informative. It talks about the framework, and it also talks about the influences of critical pedagogy and tying it into critical information literacy. And similar to Pedagogy of the Oppressed, I highly recommend everyone to read this book as well. Now, for the last slide, which I'm going to have as the remainder of the discussion, right? This chart was created by Davina Dander, who is a scholarly communications and learning support librarian at Royal Roads University. And this chart, I feel like, really lays out contextually critical information literacy and the different elements that are tied in to those practices, especially as we looked at, or especially as we tie into a lot of the critical pedagogy aspects of Paolo Freire, as he talks about social constructs, political dimensions, and how, as Nicole West Burns mentioned, there is an inherent biases, right? As we look at the different things that we would like to teach students, and also how the ACRL framework ties into the critical information literacy pedagogy part and how we teach students, what that involves, talking about the authority of a body of work, how information is processed, et cetera, and it goes from there. And then off to the right-hand side, it also addresses how we outreach, or how we commit to outreach with faculty, what that looks like, mapping out a curriculum, and how we can then introduce all of this information into the classroom. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a link in the chat so everyone can have this this particular graph. So just give me one moment, please. Oh, actually, I am so sorry. I actually do not have the link. However, what we're going to do, I'm so sorry, I do not have the link, but what I would like to do is I would like for everyone to kind of just look at this graph to assess it and see if there's anything that sticks out, or if there's any type of points that are made in this graph that you feel is the most important, especially as we take a look at critical information literacy. For me personally, I think that the outreach part is extremely important, especially as we try to introduce a lot of heavy subjects, right? As we try to introduce the themes that we discuss with critical information literacy, because when it comes to faculty and what they want us to teach, that is the biggest challenge, right? Because they have their own set of expectations relative to what we should be doing in the classroom. So I think the outreach part is extremely important. Does anyone else have any thoughts?
I was just typing into the chat, but I'll just speak it. That I agree, Don. I think that outreach is probably one of the more important parts, because I think too, there's kind of a misunderstanding of what we do and what we know. And so faculty don't really understand what we can bring to the table, and that we can go in depth into these topics. And I think they're also viewing it from a very discipline focused mindset, which is helpful, but we can provide that larger context and overarching view that I think sometimes, I don't want to say that they're lacking, but that they're just not thinking of.
No, absolutely. I definitely agree. I definitely agree.
I have sort of it's like 1.5 thoughts, because one of them is not formed, but I'll toss that there anyway. I guess the one thing that stands out to me is the curriculum mapping, because I think kind of like what Don was saying is the professors have something that they want us to do, which is, you know, teach our students everything they need to know about the library in order to write a research paper. And, you know, I know at my institution that introduction happens in English 101, but there is kind of a question of, I do think a fair amount of information literacy involves some of this more theoretical work, and how to, does that have to be foundational before they start writing a paper, right? Or, and I think there's a case for both, right? Can they be integrated? But if they're being integrated, is asking a student to write a full research paper a realistic ask if we're also trying to get them to wrap their minds around some of these, like Sarah said, these overarching themes? That being said, though, I also kind of wonder, and this is my not really formed thought yet, is what we don't, like, we have the overarching idea about information literacy, but we don't have the subject, because one of the things that came out was like the ACRL framework, and I was thinking about like the methods. Maybe I was thinking about like how information creation as a process. I think that there are critical information literacy components of subject-specific areas that need to be addressed with a kind of critical pedagogy that we don't have the knowledge to do. And so in a sense, I guess that does sort of circle back to then outreach, is how to find the place where you can come together with a faculty member and figure out, like for librarians, it might be figuring out how a faculty member does information seeking and trying to recreate maybe what the norms are in their field to then investigate, okay, but now what's problematic about this? So that's kind of a half-formed thought, but I think Sarah's point that we have this sort of big picture perspective is good, and then our non-specialization can also be a challenge.
No, very, very much so. It's a bigger challenge, I think. To Holly, like you mentioned, we're not necessarily experts in this critical information literacy like field, and there isn't like a concrete framework in terms of what that looks like. It's just a matter of having the attempt to mention a lot of these topics that are important, but it has to be relative to or relevant to the subject that students are working on. So it's difficult to have a topic like, Black Lives Matter or social justice in general when there's something specific that a criminal justice course must be focusing on, let's just say as an example. And we really have to tie in like what is more relevant for the students. Now, I'm just going to pose this as a question for everyone. Does anyone feel that critical information literacy at times is impractical? That the challenges might be a little bit too difficult?
I think in my situation, like I can sprinkle it in, but it's so hard in the way that things are set up here to do anything meaningful. And I do a lot more with my credit class, but I have the time to do it with my credit class. Whereas my writing, the stuff I do for my freshman comp class, like I'm still trying to figure out what the most effective way to do it is. Like last fall 2019, I would run into every class and there's like 50 of them. And I would say, hey, I'm a librarian, please ask me for help. And then just hope that they would ask me for help. Like I didn't have time to teach because it was just me. And so I'm still trying to figure out a way to just get past that barrier, let alone to have critical information literacy. So yeah, it's a barrier, or there are barriers to this, I guess. It's tough.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are a lot and it is tough. And there have been like times where I've also just blanketly told the instructor that's too much to cover in one class to be productive. And I think that is sometimes an eye opener for faculty as well. Like they're like, what? Because they kind of had, they have this idea, they forget their own research learning, if that makes sense. They forget how they've gotten to their doctoral level of research, and that they had to kind of plod along and do things a certain way and kind of poke and like learn. And so there's been, and it's gone over well. I've been like, that's too much. And then what I'll usually do is say, like, what is your priority for the class? And like, where do you want them to learn? And so I've been able to kind of direct the class that way and focus things a bit more. But something that we've also done that was kind of going back to what Holly was talking about earlier too, is that one of my colleagues, John Paul, and I did a session with faculty at a center conference thing, and we had them actually like write down how they find research and like how they conduct research in their field. One, we collected them all, so we've been looking at them, but two, we then also had them compared across disciplines and find the commonality and differences, and that a lot of them do a lot of the same things, they're just looking at different places. And so they're like, oh, this fashion person's doing the same thing as this business person, and they look like, opposite in disciplines, and they'd be doing different things, but they're actually doing a lot of the similar things. So I think there's that. And I feel like I had a thought when I started this train of babbling, and I have now lost it, so I apologize with it, and I'm going to stop talking. But I had to laugh, Holly, when you asked those questions in my head a little bit, not in a bad way, but just of like, you have just asked like the big librarianship question of like, what is this? Yeah.
I have another big librarianship question. Because I think this is interesting. I'm sitting here looking at these. So the critical pedagogy piece is like so great. And then it's interesting that we have this other piece that's critical information literacy. So then there's a little bit of a confusion of concepts, right? Because in one sense, we're talking about pedagogy, and then in this other sense, we're talking about information literacy. But then, I don't know, it's like information literacy is this kind of skill that we're trying to foster. And I think we're saying we want students to be able to approach it with this critical lens. But then it's like, shouldn't that just be embedded in information literacy? Like, why is that separate than the normal information literacy? And then we talk about doing critical information literacy, but we're not maybe necessarily, like, are we talking about critical information literacy pedagogy? Like, I think Don's doing a really great job of doing almost the original thinking on how to meld those two concepts. But I think as a profession, sometimes we have these buzzwords and we step back and look at them and I'm like, what does that mean? Like, who came up with that and what's the intention there? It's a little bit jargony more than meaningful.
Yeah, it's funny because, you know, like you mentioned, as I'm trying to tie a lot of these concepts together, it's difficult to address a lot of these issues in our profession and what we do. And at times it can just be like very impractical, but I do feel as if even just mentioning a little something in the class about a bias with Google, because that's relevant to information literacy, counts. To the extent of how librarians or critical information literacy librarians, however you want to call them, address this type of pedagogy, I have a problem with them not looking at the databases at all, because that was in many of the studies that I was reading, that they would just avoid the database research and talk about a lot of these topics, or more importantly, the foundation of information and how that's accessed, and why certain groups of people have the ability to actually publish information, and why other groups of people either have access to that or not, right? The the elements of access to information, and how long does that take, and how do we actually tie this into the class that they're in and why that's relevant. It really boils down to one aspect of critical pedagogy and or critical information literacy, and then discussing that in the class, because to cover almost everything, or at least a portion of it, can be very challenging, especially with the one-shot instruction, because if we want to do this, we might have to look at or revisit what we define as like a one-shot instruction, I think. And what we're doing right now, I feel like just having this conversation helps. But if it's practical, that's the biggest question. And for me, it goes back to what we're meant to do. Like, why are we in the classroom to begin with? To teach students the art of looking up information, evaluating it, and then applying it to their assignment as it tailors to what they need to work on. So I think that this critical pedagogy part, as we're trying to integrate that, it has to be very selective, in my opinion. And that's why, moving forward, we have to try to find practical ways to integrate this where we can kind of just create like a hybrid. Now critical information literacy to me ties in more to critical pedagogy, but we want to focus more on the information literacy part, right? Because Holly, to your point, there is a distinct different in a way. And I feel like critical information literacy ties way too much into critical pedagogy, in my opinion.
One thing that's also coming to me as we're like talking about this, I'm trying to like I'm like doing thought experiment as a student, right? So if someone pitched to me like, okay, these databases are this form of like information privilege that you have, but also they're the result of this process that is also exclusionary to a lot of perspectives. So then what do you think as a student? What's your choice? Then it's like, well, if the databases are problematic, then why don't I just search the web? But then it's like, well, if Google also has its problems. So it's like, I think to me, a challenge that seems like it's almost emerging from like our conversations is that that the information infrastructure that we have to guide students through is inherently biased, racist, like messed up. But our job is still to teach them to navigate it while telling them that this is not an equitable system. And so how do we teach that? And how, as a student, if you don't have any of that foundational understanding or background, how do you process someone being like, this database is racist, Google's racist? Now, find information from both of those sources to write your research paper, but make sure your research paper isn't racist. It's like,
yeah.
And I don't know. I don't have, like I said, that just occurred to me. It's just thoughts.
No, and that's very real. Because it's almost like, where do you go to get information? Where do I get my stuff if everybody's racist or there are discriminatory practices and there's oppression everywhere? And I think that's why, like, a lot of the critique, especially with Paulo Freire, was his perspective of how radical the pedagogy part must be. Because at the end, it's encouraging students and participants to actually have a plan of action to address this issue. I actually let's talk about that. Is that even necessary, do you think, to encourage students to politically act on an oppressive institution? Should we have that as an expectation if this is something that is almost intertwined with the framework of critical pedagogy? Like, you know what? Since Google's racist, I'm going to need you to fix that down the line. Or something like them to consider solving that issue with a collective group of people that have a similar, I guess, goal. Should we put that on the student?
I mean, in a certain way, are we not being political in almost everything that we do? And, you know, in a sense, like what we choose to buy, where we choose to like frequent, you know, is that not somewhat political in every, you know, who we're talking to, who we're not talking to, and like whose voices we lift up. And so I think that like that is a permeating thing throughout our lives, whether like, you know, it's just there. And so it's not that we're necessarily putting it on the students, we're just essentially calling and shedding light on what's already existing, if that makes sense. And so, and if we want the system to change, then I think we kind of have to continue shedding light onto it, because then we're helping to be the agents of that change, and they can help be the agents of the change in the future. So for me, I think it's fine. But that's just my personal opinion.
Of course.
I think this idea though of a radical pedagogy is something to think about though, right? Is we're going to point this out to you and then keep doing what we're doing. That seems like you know, like that seems like having Women's History Month, right? Like we'll let the little ladies have their month, but the rest of the year they won't get any sort of support when they, you know, when they work 3 jobs and have a baby, and then they'll have no income. Like, so it's like, is highlighting it a way to make ourselves feel better about not doing enough to change it fundamentally? Because we're the only ones who can do that, right? And I'm not really sure how we go about doing that, but I guess I would step back and say, what would a radical pedagogy for information literacy that is an inherently biased institution, like, that you have to navigate, like what would a radical pedagogy look like? And I think all of us can point to the pedagogy that we do being very standard is like, we all kind of do it the same way, and we know that that's the way it's been being done since, especially information literacy instruction had to become our bread and butter.
No, it's definitely a great point. It's one of those conversations that I think it really just depends on not only the librarian, but it also depends on the comfort of teaching. I think the biggest thing is being well versed in this type of pedagogical framework, because it entails you knowing a lot of this information. Me, I am learning in this process. It's just a matter of me just sharing this information, but a lot of this personally is still new. So even for me, as I, you know, as we continue to go down this route of finding new ways to address and or you know, share this information with students, bringing this into the classroom, I think it's like a baby step type of process. It definitely can't happen overnight. I know for me personally, because with this type of information, the students have to take away something. They have to take away from whatever we're teaching, and it has to be informative, and it has to be relevant to their assignments, but to themselves as well. And I think there are ways in which to do that, and we will be discussing that in the future, especially as we touch more on a lot of the lesson planning aspects of critical information literacy in our next workshop, and how we can address this, or we will be addressing this in SUNY Law in June, talking more about the practical approaches, because I do think that we can introduce this, we can make this happen. It's just a matter of how, and ways in which it makes sense, and ways in which students can take the most out of our teachings. And this just continues the conversation and or discussion about us evolving as librarians and the more things that we can do in the classroom.
I had one last thought. It just struck me that it's like, okay, if you want students, it's like, meet them where they're at. They're going to Google, and tell them you can Google, but you have to find a scholarly article. But when you find the scholarly article, if you don't have access to it, come and get it from the library. And it's like, is that kind of way of thinking how to make these systems work against each other a way to approach it? I'm gonna write that down, and we'll keep thinking about it.
Please do. Please do.
You know, I popped in the chat real quick, but I put that I think it's also important to remember that the classroom is not our only place for instruction, and that, like, we're talking about a lot of these concepts that we can expand out from the classroom. Like, they don't need to only occur in that instruction session, and that we can utilize our library and like our outreach of the library as a place to start also having these conversations.
Can't agree with you more. Now it is 3:29. I don't want to hold anybody hostage, but it's about to hit 3:30. Before we conclude, does anyone else want to share with everything that we talked about before we conclude? Can't agree with you more, Sarah. Once again, yes, that was definitely a session that just flew by without a doubt, especially towards the latter part as we started to really talk about pedagogy and how we can implement it.
Thanks so much, everyone. I really enjoyed these. It's so
no.
nice to chat with everyone.
No, definitely. No, this experience is a lot of fun. And yeah, I mean, can't do it without you guys. So thank you for everyone that attended today. Our next SILC event will be next Wednesday at 1 o'clock. Brandon, did I get that date and time right? SILC community conversation next Wednesday at 1 o'clock.
You're on mute.
Yes.
Good. That's all I needed. But all right, you guys, thank you for coming. Thank you guys for having this wonderful conversation, and hope to see everyone soon next week. All right, but until then, take care.